Have you ever noticed how we learn about history with increasingly fine and minute periods of study? Isn't that odd? We go from broadly discussing the seemingly snail's pace of human advancement 10,000 years ago to splitting the Roman Empire into two periods. Then we examine the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries as 100-block periods. Sometimes we'll take a brief intermission, taking in the world wars year by year, emerging on the other end looking at history by decade, all the way to contemporary society, where we remark on specific years in the last few decades that gave birth to some notable event or historic invention. Doesn't it feel like more has happened in the last, say, 30 years than any other 30-year period in history? Just look at how dense this graph becomes. We've gone from the invention of the World Wide Web, which would shortly be picking up just a little steam in the years following, all the way to today's mind-bogglingly thin, tiny screens in our pocket that can instantly connect us to any page, any person, or anything we so desire. By comparison, in 1776, the first prototype for a submarine, which would need much more than 100 years to fully develop, much longer for widespread use, is only followed up a little less than 30 years later by a hand crank that separates cotton seeds from cotton fibers, and that's the late 18th century. Long before that, we study the advancement of ancient civilizations in 10,000-year periods, marking the development of agriculture, followed by what seems to be a millennium of silence. Why? I'm inclined to assume what I'm about to say is common knowledge, but considering how I felt when I first discovered this, allow me to be a bit theatrical. It provides a nice starting point to tackle this question, and might boggle your mind if you were unaware. There are quite a few uncontacted, isolated, primitive human tribes remaining on the planet, perfectly preserved time capsules of ancient years your history teachers would have you believe are buried deep in the past by eons and eons. These are people living as close to early humans as we could possibly observe in the year 2020. Wrap your mind around that. You could buy a plane ticket right now, fly to Brazil, sail up the Amazon River, and float back down the way you came with a wooden arrow in your chest. Yeah, most of them aren't very friendly. You'd also have violated Brazilian law too, but it'd certainly make a great story, so tweet me if you do it. The point is, undisturbed, these tribes are complacent. I've seen many suggest their lack of outreach is cruel and immoral as we withhold our cornucopia of modern inventions. But these uncontacted peoples are content, aggressively so. What can we even do? The headlines showing the militant resistance of these uncontacted tribes are certainly eye-catching, but that's not even always the case. There are so-called tribes well acquainted with modern society that are dedicated to preserving their way of life, their culture, their rich customs. Oh, how did that image slip in there? Even if it means that, for an extreme example, a spice will be chosen over a vaccine. But why are they so conservative? For politically conscious people, detach yourself from the connotations you have with the word conservatism and take a step back. The ideology is rooted in people like this that see nothing wrong with the status quo. There's nothing to aspire to if you're happy with the wild banana harvest of the Amazon. Change objectively carries some stress for all humans, so why bother? Why not conserve the peaceful existence you have? After all, who knows what lies ahead? What if it's worse than what you have now? And you've got to think it probably is, considering how fulfilled your current lifestyle makes you. After all, we are literally hardwired to gain pleasure from successfully living off of the earth. If we didn't, we wouldn't have been a viable species. Maybe we've just done fewer notable things and made less technological progress for so long, not necessarily for some empirical objective reason. Maybe we're looking at the problem entirely wrong, through a modern lens. My audience primarily consists of high schoolers, so let me make a comparison. If you're anything like me, you've always looked at the transition to college with distaste. If I had the choice between going to 13th grade and enrolling in college or pursuing other means of enrichment, I'd have probably chosen the former, even if I'd miss out on the opportunities of the latter. Maybe what made us a successful species, receiving positive feedback for survival, hindered our growth. It's often trumpeted around that humans triumphed over Neanderthals because we would go forth venturing into the unknown. That's a bit optimistic, I think. We may have had at best curiosity and at worst the suicidal impulse to survive in the tundra, but we had nothing greater to aspire to, really. It's not like we had a score, a goal. No outside factors to force us forward, no problems to solve. What I'm approaching is that these civilizations representing the world thousands of years ago didn't and probably will never have the necessary ingredients to drive organic technological advancement, like, say, fierce rivalries where one country has to repeatedly one-up the other. They don't have easily interconnected, booming urban towns where ideas like meritocracy and inventions like gunpowder can trickle in from the east 10,000 miles away. They don't have a need to innovate to meet an increasing demand for food. Everyone spends most of the day working to fulfill that need anyway. But at the same time, they don't have an overabundance that would allow progressively more complex specialization and invention. Point in case, compare Mesoamerica with these tribes in Brazil that have existed for tens of thousands of years. This is something to take a deeper look at in another video, but it's a widespread misconception that in the 16th century, the Aztecs and Mayans were savages with a few fluke urban centers. At the very least, it's a misconception in the way that some people can only name the wacky calendar as a Native American invention that was ahead of its time, when in reality, they were making plenty more unheard of discoveries in their booming, grand cities that would eventually crumble alongside its people, succumbing to European disease. The geography and food density of the Amazon, among a variety of other factors, was just not conducive to urbanization, and urbanization is required for specialization, and specialization is the causation of the sensation of automation and innovation to end starvation, stagflation, and migration, and the fixation of the aggregation of the nation in various technologically advanced urban centers that seem to just not sprout up in South America outside of the Incan Empire. How does this tie into the broadly interconnected world? Forgive my bias, but let's start where AP Modern World History starts. Giving a little bit of background though. Oversimplification warning. In the time before the plague, no, not that one, Europe was a land of barbarians. Rome itself had fallen to savages multiple times, and for centuries Norsemen and Germanic raiders had forced isolated, fortified, hostile communities under a necessary, rigidly militaristic social and political hierarchy. Lords and their serf-filled manors constituted what barely passed as Western civilization at the time. Now let's go for a lightning round to the modern day. If you're a historian, I'm sorry in advance, but here's a brief history of technology. The Black Death created labor shortages, raised the standard of living across the continent, and drastically improved wages. These changes fractured the binding system of feudalism, many serfs finding themselves free, many nobles finding their families dead, and their coffers empty. Wait, how are we gonna run the farms now? Wind power, water power, animal power. Beginning to blossom at the time was a newfound and widespread social mobility that led to a flourishing of individualism, humanism, secularism, and all the other isms that are conducive to societal progress. Wealth was concentrated in fewer, freer individuals who were suddenly very interested in not only studying the scientific works of antiquity, but improving upon them. Wait, while we're all renaissancing and all, I got a problem. The coal mines keep flooding. Maybe we could pump them out? Maybe burn the on-site coal to create pressure difference to pump a piston? Oh my god, steam engine! As the forests began to thin out and the English supply of charcoal was depleting, industry in Britain had to now seek a different fuel source, increasing reliance on coal. At the same time, the fierce colonial competitions and untapped markets driving expansion both east and west were bringing in sugar, tobacco, cotton, cocoa, and more. But they didn't come in like this. As they were carted off the flutes, they looked more like this. Now we have to build refineries. Wait, now we're running out of land to feed these people, and now we're running out of people to feed the land. That's another macro level problem that only arises when you can view an entire island nation of hundreds of thousands of people through one lens. And the solution is another agricultural revolution. But wait, steam engine? Coal? Factories? Now that we've proto-industrialized agriculture, all this food is giving us a lot of workers. Maybe we went a bit overboard? Well, we'll send them to the mines and send them to the factories. And now wages are rising and those urban factory workers want luxury goods, so let's build more factories. Wait, we're kinda running out of resources. We've gone basically everywhere, and no one has rubber. Crimes against humanity time, more raw goods, new inventions, more factories, nationalism, imperialism, militarism. Hang on, that Austrian died? To arms, I guess. Fun fact, some would call this the Chemist War due to the premature invention and subsequent horrific use of high explosives and chemical weapons that got shoved to the forefront of technology with the sole intent of ending the lives of other humans in the cruelest ways imaginable. Hoorah, technology. Speaking of, in Wee Wee 2, we just had to top poison gas with the atomic bomb. Ever notice how, in Sid Meier's Civilization 5, this period in history has technologically stunning headlines that make you think, where would we be today without, say, replaceable parts? But the vast majority of the inventions are militaristic. Speaking of militarism, ever notice how for half a century after Wee Wee 2, the top two global superpowers accelerated technological progress to such an insane, mind-boggling extent that we got space travel, which otherwise probably would have taken many centuries more to organically begin, all in the name of clout. Let's start to reel it all in. From vast urban societies that allow intellectuals to flourish and solve problems, to really put on the steam, to throw jet fuel on the fire, you add rivalries, an interconnected world, problems to solve, and niches to fulfill, most of which were issues and market gaps the engineers and entrepreneurs would have had no experience with had they not been added to one globalized web of humanity. And these new problems to solve always come from some other human invention. It's infinitely expanding, appearing as though technological progress shouldn't be linear, but exponential. and it certainly seems that way. It's almost fractal. Just take a look at software for a microcosm of this. Computers went from looking like this to this, and along the way brilliant people made their own contributions, often piggybacking off established inventions, but sometimes seeking their own personal innovation. So, to pose a very rough example, let's say there are a few kingdoms of laptop models, phyla of operating systems, classes of programs, orders of, say, browsers, families of websites, genuses of, content formats, all spectacularly working together to make a chain of one-way dependency to deliver you the species of Jumpy Doge. Speaking of computers, that slides us into contemporary society, the most potent example of the intro question. We don't exactly have a cutthroat global competition going on right now. I'm not saying modern radical movements are unimportant, but stop and think about how we're in a relative calm. To the young people watching, imagine going to school to do drills in the event that your suburban paradise suddenly becomes very well acquainted with the Tsar Bomba. Before that, imagine getting drafted at 18 to go die in a war between modern European superpowers. Well, if my unfaltering, droning voice hasn't lulled you into a state of vegetation, you might be actively expecting me to say that the 21st century is a perfect storm of technological advancement for a multitude of reasons that don't include fierce competition. Maybe I'd take a deep dive into if capitalism creates niches to fulfill. Maybe I'll develop that claim that technological progress is fractal and exponential and we've reached a critical mass. Maybe I'll tie this all back in a more literal way and acknowledge that I've just been looking at technology, not entirely addressing the bigger question, has more just happened in the last few decades? In that case, maybe I could talk about population. I've said our progress has been exponential, but really so is our population. I mean, our technological progress couldn't truly be exponential though, right? That would imply that we're gearing up for an insanely immense, rapid technological advancement, and that makes me feel insignificant and apprehensive. But what if it's recency bias? The tendency to place more importance on events and discoveries the more recent they are. After all, these things, computers and drones, are relatively new, built upon years of innovation. We're taking the metallurgy, precision engineering, electrochemistry, and other fundamental elements that were built upon all for granted. When those inventions came about, they were probably as life-changing as computers. I know that at the beginning of the video I pointed at the cotton gin to laugh at it, but that was cherry picking. I said the cotton gin, but I could have easily said instead vaccination, representing the start of humanity's long and ongoing conquest of disease. I'll grant that the time period, the late 1700s, is still cutting it close. So how about this? In 1440, Gutenberg invented the printing press with metal movable type. 10 years later, we get spectacles for nearsighted people like myself, and a bit more than 20 years after that, muzzle-loaded rifles are invented, forever changing warfare as we know it. In another world, I could have made this video 200 years in the future, saying that at the turn of the 21st century, in 30 years, we went from Tickle Me Elmo and a singing bass on your wall in the 90s to the modern glorious inventions of the avocado saver, the stick, and the infamous Snuggie. Maybe I'd have made a similar video like this in the 1400s, the only differences being that it'd be a manuscript, not a video, and it'd be a lot more racist regarding these so-called uncivilized tribes. The astute among you must have already realized by now that I'm playing both sides for the sake of a counter-argument, cherry-picking for each in some sort of twisted game. Because after all, every video essay needs a counter-argument, right? So what's the real answer? You might have come up with your own at the beginning of the video and commented your dissertation-level response, maybe to add to the discussion, but probably just in a dire attempt to prove to the world that you're intelligent. You also might have had a bone to pick with the way I presented the history of technological progress, maybe commenting below how much nuance I did away with. And that same demographic might be extremely annoyed that I'm going on another tangent full of hypothetical language. Maybe you're waiting for me to give a satisfactory conclusion so you can just comment epic. Maybe I'll pretend like I've been speaking so hypothetical to make my personal conclusion that much more full of contrast. Maybe, just maybe, I'll turn the overall pessimistic tone of the video around. I've danced around the idea for a while, but it's entirely a fantasy to juxtapose those short bursts of Renaissance inventions to the modern eruption of technology that used to be considered entirely science fiction. It would be a fallacy to set these inventions on top of one another and compare the times that passed between them. To do so would ignore the true extent of fractalization. No amount of cherry-picking examples will give you a complete picture because in reality, it's lopsided. Heavily skewed in favor of the almost 5 billion patents the US alone has awarded just from 2000 to 2019. Sure, a fraction of that is made up by Snuggies and Avo holders. I mean, what fraction of those patents do you think are major? 33%? 10%? 1%? Doesn't matter. Even if 0.1% of those inventions are major, that's still 5 million, again in the US alone in just the last 20 years. We've also ignored the true mind-bogglingly large world population. If there were one Plato per the world's population in his time, we'd have 43 Platos in today's society. That's just Plato too. Socrates and Aristotle were his rough contemporaries. And think about the would-be polymaths that have been stuck in fields all their lives. That lets me segue into the very uncontroversial topic of modern political, social, and economic systems. I won't talk about the merits of capitalism because that is way above my pay grade, but no matter how you look at it, human civilization is the freest it's ever been. We've legally triumphed over massively scaled institutions of coercive labor, from the slave trade to serfdom, and moving forward we've instituted reform after reform. We take it for granted because we grew up under these systems, but compulsory education only started picking up steam just 100 years ago. We are curious, forever venturing into the unknown, but we aren't entirely foolish. We are not lost in the tundra. Rivalries and macro-level problems accelerate progress, sure, but that's not the true answer. These uncontacted tribes presumably have had clan feuds, even wars, for eons. They've also had to face a changing climate, to deal with food mismanagement, and they've had the chance to take in what little outside influence they've received. I teased it a while ago, but I really do think we're at a critical mass, if not of population, then of invention. Allow me to explain, but first, this video has been sponsored by Raid Shadow. Just kidding. This video has been vaguely inspired by many people, but most of all by Vsauce, and it was in one of Michael's videos that I first heard this quote by Albert Einstein. As our circle of knowledge expands, so too does the circumference of darkness surrounding it. In other words, the more we push forward, the further it seems we can go, and that's exactly what we're doing. Thanks for watching. No outro this time, video too long.